Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and as the host of the program, I will quite often receive emails, and here in Charlottesville now, as I've become somewhat identified with the rioting that went on here a few weeks back, several people have sent me fairly heated emails regarding the new American slavery. And then just last week, Terry McAuliffe addressed this in which he talks about the incarceration rate amongst the black population in Virginia. And join us to give us a little insight on this is from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Hans Bader. Hans, welcome back to the program. How are you doing, sir?
Fine. How are you?
Well, still puzzled as we circle around this. I watch Republicans and Democrats alike. They will see an issue clearly as a bell and then go at it the wrong direction. We have, for example, a Republican member of the Virginia Senate that wants to join Dorothy McAuliffe to subsidize grocery stores because there are areas that have lost all their jobs and now have no grocery stores. And instead of trying to get those neighborhoods more prosperous, they just say, let's subsidize the grocery stores. This seems to be the same thing. This is, to me anyway, that this is the tail wagging the dog. If there are a large percentage of blacks being incarcerated in Virginia, we need to look at the why that's happening, not just saying we should have racial quotas in incarcerations. I can see how that's going to go badly almost immediately. Right.
I mean, the Daily Wire reported that Governor McAuliffe was pushing for racial quotas for incarceration in his recent speech to the Brookings Institution.
Mm-hmm.
And he was claiming that the disproportionate incarceration of blacks was the product of deeply rooted racism, when in reality, according to the Supreme Court in its Armstrong opinion, there's no presumption that members of different races commit crimes at the same rate, and in fact there are huge disparities. The murder rate among blacks is 8 times higher than among non-Hispanic whites, and victim-reported crimes, which are least susceptible to being affected by prosecutor or police bias, also show a substantial multiple. And part of that's what you would expect from, poverty and single-parent households,
mm-hmm.
because, criminologists have found that people in poverty have higher crime rates, and people who come from single-parent households also have higher crime rates.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that does not fully explain the difference between the white and the black crime rate. Even after you factor that in, you still find that the black homicide rate is still higher, and other violent crime rates are usually still higher. And on the other hand, you find a few crimes for which the white crime rate is higher, like child pornography is a crime disproportionately committed by whites.
Mm-hmm.
So, as the Supreme Court has noted in its Armstrong decision, there's no presumption that different races commit crimes at exactly the same rate, and that's contradicted by reality. And in fact, the FBI and Bureau of Justice Statistics data shows that there are huge differences in crime rates between members of different races. So to abolish the disproportionately higher black incarceration rate, you would have to have racial quotas for criminal convictions, which is something that you would think anyone would realize is unconstitutional.
Oh, yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily stop people because, the federal appeals courts back in the 90s found that it was unconstitutional to have racial quotas for school suspensions.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they found that was because there were any number of school boards which either were voluntarily doing this or they were doing it at the behest of liberal judges in desegregation decrees.
Mm-hmm.
And the Court of Appeals in Chicago said that was unconstitutional in People Who Care versus Rockford Board of Education. It said that demanding that blacks not be referred for discipline at a higher rate than whites was in effect a racial quota, and it was unjust and led to huge double standards in, treatment of similarly situated students, and it was unconstitutional and a violation of the Civil Rights Act. And yet we see a profound push from people like Congressman McEachin
mm-hmm.
to effectively have exactly such racial quotas in school discipline, and we see that the liberal staff attorneys at the Federal Office for Civil Rights are investigating 3 major Virginia school systems based on not any type of racism in intent, but rather just disproportionately higher suspension rates for black versus white students. And in fact, the ACLU's complaint against the Richmond schools doesn't cite one scintilla of evidence that there's intentional racism, doesn't even argue that. It just argues that even absent any such discriminatory intent or racism, the school should still be liable under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act just because it has a higher black suspension rate than whites, and does so for offenses that are not defined with incredible precision. Like it says that punishing people for obscene or vulgar language is a violation of Title VI if more blacks are punished for violating it than whites because the offense is not perfectly objective. And that ignores the fact that the subjectivity is not the reason why more of them are being suspended than whites or disciplined than whites. And in fact, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia has noted that the highest ratio of suspended blacks to whites is precisely for the most objective offenses. So this whole subjectivity/school-to-prison pipeline nonsense that is being spewed by left-wing academics like Russell Skiba is factually false. It was debunked eons ago by federal appellate court rulings, which are now being systematically ignored by people like Governor McAuliffe and Congressman McEachin, and being systematically ignored by civil rights bureaucrats who essentially pressure school systems to do the very same thing that Judge Posner, for the unanimous Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, said was unconstitutional back in the Federal Appeals Court decision in People Who Care versus Rockford Board of Education, which said that racial quotas are unconstitutional, and it is a quota to demand that no higher percentage of blacks be suspended than whites. Because the reality is, given things like single-parent households and poverty, the indiscipline rate, the misbehavior rate, is frankly a heck of a lot higher among some racial groups than others. And this is just a fact recognized in the analogous context by the Supreme Court's Armstrong decision, and a fact that used to be recognized across the political spectrum, but which the Democratic Party in the last 5 years has essentially decided to reject in a type of flat earthism, kind of flat earth mindset where they refuse to accept the statistical reality that crime rates are not the same among different racial groups, that school discipline rates are not the same among members of different racial groups. They reject a basic common sense reality about crime and school discipline that the Supreme Court, including most of the liberal Supreme Court justices, recognized 20 years ago in the Armstrong decision. The pendulum has shifted so much that the Democrats have gone way out of left field, and they are now endorsing extreme racial quota mentality positions that once upon a time even they would have recognized were extreme and at odds with reality.
Well, and my point in this always is, Hans, that point to a law that says arrest more black people than white people, and I'll agree with you in a heartbeat that it's racist. And this is where I worry about where the media especially picks up on this idea of dog whistles and things like that. We had a young lady testify before Charlottesville City Council before they went nuts that her nephew was incarcerated for only stealing $250 worth of somebody's stuff. I think it may have been a car stereo or something like that. But she was acknowledging the fact that her nephew had stolen from someone else. And I guess that's where I really pull my hair out in this, is point to me a law that's unjust and we'll get rid of it. But there don't seem to be any instances where they can point to a law or a Commonwealth's attorney or a police chief that's out there just rounding up the usual suspects. You can make the case stop and frisk can be disproportionate because there's some subjectivity to that. But as far as a law, if you get convicted of stealing something, you stole it, don't say it's because I was a particular race beforehand. And I guess that's where I really wonder with guys like Terry McAuliffe is how can you justify saying this when you are the governor? You could write laws that supposedly fix this, but you don't. You just go out there and make the political points out of it. Exactly, and the more reliable social science data says that it's differences in behavior that lead to these disparities in conviction rates and school suspension rates. For example, John Paul Wright and a number of other researchers found that it was prior problem behavior among students, not racism by school officials, that led to a higher black suspension rate. And social science researchers have also found that when you arbitrarily push down suspension rates of violent or disruptive students, that harms black students most, because the schools that are already somewhat disorderly to begin with tend to be poor inner-city schools. And they're the ones that have real anarchy when you curb suspensions as a basic, vital tool of removing disruptive people from the classroom who are keeping other people from learning. And so researchers such as Joshua Kinsler have found that in public schools with discipline problems,
it hurts those innocent African-American children academically to keep disruptive students in the classroom. And cutting out-of-school suspensions in those schools widens the black-white achievement gap. In fact, it harms black people. It increases the black-white achievement gap when you make it impossible to suspend troublemakers. And Max Eden in the New York Post cites additional studies that so find. He's a researcher at the Manhattan Institute who's been very critical of this push by the Obama administration and liberal politicians like Congressman McEachin to effectively have racial quotas in school discipline because precisely he thinks that it harms black students most because the victims of violence by black students are disproportionately other black students because of the high frequency of black-on-black crime and black-on-black assaults.
Sure. And isn't that the disingenuity of pushes like Black Lives Matter? Because they'll go after an instance where a police officer involved shooting might involve a white or Latino police officer and a black student or a black citizen, and in some cases even a black police officer and a black citizen. But then when 14 people are shot and 7 of them killed in Chicago because the Black Lives Matter movement is completely silent on it.
Right. There's a very deep disconnect there, and unfortunately, it looks like if you look at schools, you find that black principals actually suspend at a higher rate than white principals. So it's not a function of white racism that this discipline rate is going on, and you also find that black police officers do not shoot at a lower rate than white police officers. So racism does not appear to be the primary reason for police shootings. It does not even appear to be a statistically significant component of police shootings. Now, there is some evidence that police stops may be, to some extent, racism may be a factor in some of the disparity between blacks and whites in police stops. But in terms of arrests and convictions generally, it's such a tiny factor compared to the higher conviction rate resulting from higher black crime rate that it just pales in comparison. It's a drop in the bucket. It's like saying that, if you, I'm trying to think of a better example, but it's like a rounding error in terms of the total, incarceration rate, and total arrest rate. So, what's an overwhelming thing that's going on is just a function of problematic behavior, not racism. And I think, if you look at, there was that black Harvard economist who studied police shootings, and he found that for police shootings, racism was not a statistically significant factor in why there were more black suspects shot than the black percentage of the population, because the percentage of black people shot by police is pretty much consistent with the higher black crime rate. And the rate of blacks being convicted for, use of force on police officers and the like. So it's pretty much what you'd expect. Now, he did find there was some evidence of racism in other aspects of the criminal justice system. Like he found that certain types of use of force, non-deadly use of force, there was some statistical evidence of race playing a role, but it was just dwarfed by the disparities in things like actual committing of crimes.
Well, Hans, let me ask you, then moving forward, and you said there are some spots, especially I think we mentioned earlier, stop and frisk in some of those programs that are put forth often by liberal Democrat city councilors who want, crime cleaned up, but then when it's caught, that their police officers are stopping black kids more frequently than white kids, they blanch at the idea of stopping it. These sorts of things can be addressed, but if we spend our time talking about this, and I mean Terry McAuliffe and Don McEachin and these folks talking about the ridiculous side of it, it keeps us from being able to actually address instances where there might really be some racial disparity and just making their case for populism and trying to use this division to win elected office.
Yeah, there's already a remedy for actual racism. For like in schools, you could sue the individual racist teacher under Section 1981 for damages, and you can also presumably get, relief under the 14th Amendment against the school system. If you actually can show that you were treated worse than a similar situated white kid, you could make a lot of money by suing
Yeah.
that teacher and those school officials. There already is a remedy. For police, the remedies are somewhat more limited. Like prosecutors have immunities of certain kinds. But even for police departments, if you have a pattern or practice of intentional discrimination by police, there ought to be a lawyer who can get a lot of attorney's fees suing over that.
Mm-hmm.
And there are constitutional protections against such things. So if there were really a big pattern of racism, by definition, this is something that lawyers would not shy away from litigating, the way they sue big companies in class action lawsuits, even based on rather weak social science findings of discrimination, the way Walmart was sued over what was essentially a very dubious sociological theory about why its gender disparities were supposedly the result of discrimination. They were able to sue over that, bring a massive lawsuit. If there actually were racism by school officials, you could sue not everybody involved in the process.
Mm-hmm.
You could sue teachers, you could sue principals under Section 1981, you could sue the school system under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. For the police, the same thing is true. You could sue them under 1983. The fact that people don't do that is a sign that overwhelmingly suspensions and criminal convictions are not influenced by bias.
Well,
and that even police stops where there is some evidence of bias, the overwhelming majority of the police stops are based on legitimate factors that are defensible under the Fourth Amendment.
Well, and also, considering we've had 8 years of judicial appointments by the Obama administration, even the courts tend to lean left right now, Hans. So you can't even claim that there's a bias in the courtrooms where judges are generally going to be political appointees, U.S. attorneys, things like that are in many cases at this point still remnants of Obama appointees.
Oh, yes, and like the Baltimore consent decree was entered based on what would have been considered junk science by the federal appeals court that is superior to the district judge who entered the consent decree. I mean, there are old federal appeals court rulings that say statistical disparities don't prove discrimination, and they are binding Fourth Circuit precedent. And the liberal trial judge who entered that consent decree essentially ignored all that, ignored comments from lawyers and others, pointing to the fact that however many problems Baltimore may have, they're not, racism problems.
Yeah. So do we run into, and certainly here in the, unfortunately now, hashtag the new Ferguson in Charlottesville, where we're flagship from, we're now known as this town of great racial disparity because of the Unite the Right versus Black Lives Matter Antifa riots here a few weeks ago. But is this the fruit of stuff like Terry McAuliffe and Don McEachin going out and fanning these flames and then creating almost a cottage industry around claiming racism, and it almost as a society we're becoming the boy who cried wolf. The more we scream it, the less actual instances of racism get attention.
It is. It's baffling because essentially what they're doing is they're scapegoating their fellow Democrats, because most prosecutors are Democrats, most school teachers are Democrats. They're not hostile to black people, and yet they're essentially being depicted by their party leaders as these evil racists who are busy framing, I guess they're not literally saying framing black suspects, because they're arguing that the mere statistical disparity, even absent any racist intent, is somehow,
right,
institutionalized racism. But it is bizarre to essentially depict these units of government that are controlled mainly by members of their own party as institutionally racist. I mean, Bill Clinton didn't do this. Bill Clinton may have been very politically correct on some things, but on crime, he recognized that if you allow crime to fester, it will harm black people most. And, the Clinton administration didn't argue that if you have, a higher black arrest rate or conviction rate, that is a proof of racism, even though it's really just the result of a higher black crime rate. In the Armstrong case, the Justice Department did not take that radical position, which essentially would have thrown prosecutors under the bus. But the Obama administration did essentially throw teachers under the bus in the school discipline area, and you see people like McAuliffe essentially throwing local prosecutors and police under the bus, too, by insisting that the higher black conviction rate and arrest rate, which is 99% attributable to a higher black crime rate, is somehow this result of institutional racism, even though criminologists could explain for days on end why this is not true. And it's contrary to FBI Uniform Crime Report data, and contrary to Bureau of Justice Statistics data, and contrary to the U.S. Supreme Court's observation back in 1996 in the Armstrong case that there's no presumption that members of different races commit crimes at the same rate, because that's contradicted by reality. So I don't know why they're doing this. It's a very radical position. It's essentially throwing members of their own party, like teachers, under the bus. Mm-hmm. It threatens to result in vastly increased crime rate and school violence rate, because Max Eden studied school systems like Oklahoma City, where they essentially capped suspensions, particularly of minority students, to try and get their suspension rate down to appease liberal Obama administration officials, and they found that there was a vast increase in disorder and that teachers were being assaulted without any real serious punishment.
Sure.
As a result of, there's just a huge amount of disorder. He said, one Denver teacher said that under the new discipline policies, students had threatened to harm or kill teachers with no meaningful consequences.
Unbelievable.
One teacher in the Oklahoma public schools said, "We were told that referrals would not require suspension unless there was blood." That was the result of them being told by the Obama administration, you need to have what are essentially racial quotas in school suspensions, and them pushing down the school suspensions, particularly for minority offenders. And another teacher in Oklahoma City, after Oklahoma City entered into a consent decree with the Obama administration, said, students are yelling, cursing, hitting, and screaming at teachers, and nothing is being done, but teachers are being told to teach and ignore the behaviors. These students know there's nothing a teacher can do. And in Buffalo, a teacher noted, we have fights here almost every day. These kids walk around and say, we can't get suspended. We don't care what you say. In St. Paul, the Democratic county attorney even noted that the number of assaults against teachers had doubled and called the situation a public health crisis.
Jeez. Well, and then you see what winds up happening here. Another example in Charlottesville, they set aside $1 million the other year. It was 2 years ago, Hans, to teach recent high school graduates, give them a program where they could come back and remediate their reading skills that they had somehow graduated high school without only a year or two earlier. So what we see is, again, as you pointed out, failing the black community in substance, whereas it seems to benefit the politician in style.
Yeah, what they're doing is they're basically ripping at a racial scab to motivate voters to turn out from them, to appease their political base, even though this is damaging institutions that are central to social mobility. Mm-hmm. If you come from a poor family, single-parent household, and you can't get a decent education because your classroom is raucous and disorderly because the troublemakers are never suspended, because they can't be suspended for things that the ACLU says are just too vague to withstand racial disproportionality scrutiny, like a ban on constantly disrupting class or vulgar or abusive language, which is what the ACLU says is just too vague for a school rule, and it's Richmond Schools complaint. If you can't do anything about those troublemakers, those students can't learn, and then the classroom is often the only place where they could learn because of their bad home environment.
Well,
if you're a kid who comes from a wealthy family, you have a good home environment, your parents can teach you even if the school fails. But if you're a poor kid, that school is your lifeline, and when you destroy that school's orderliness by restrictions on suspensions, you're destroying the ability of the students to learn.
And also implicitly, it would seem you're also telling that those kids who are trying to learn that there's no reward in learning. You should go out and be with the disruptors because they seem to be having the way of the land. Yeah,
they've been taught a lot that studying is acting white. There are diversity trainers like Glenn Singleton who say that essentially that being planning oriented and being quiet is a white characteristic, whereas being emotional and personal and loud is a black characteristic. He's black himself, so he can say these insulting racist stereotypes that would get a white person fired for saying such racist things.
That's amazing.
And, the school systems in Virginia, they hire him for six figures to teach teachers about institutional racism and how blacks are supposedly different from whites by nature. And essentially, the net message you get, this message is instilled in you, is that it's studying and being quiet or acting white, which is a very damaging stereotype to have, and it probably harms the ability to convince kids from troubled backgrounds to learn, because they figure if they're studious and quiet and are paying attention in class, maybe they're acting white.
Yeah, and it's horrible, but it just benefits the politicians. Hans, of course, CEI.org, and find out more, read more about his work on this. Thank you so much for spending this time with us this weekend on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Please be members in whatever way you can at tertiumquids.com. My name is Joe, and joining us on the phone from the American Conservative Union, and of course, you know, we always love bringing our special broadcast from CPAC every year with the American Conservative Union. Ian Walters is with the American Conservative Union Foundation with an event coming up on Columbus Day to coincide with the final gubernatorial debate. Ian, welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
Hi, Joe. I'm well. How are you?
Oh, you know, doing great here, and you know, it certainly seems like. So, who is putting together this final gubernatorial debate in Wise on Columbus Day?
Well, you got to keep in mind that this debate is put on by the Debate Commission for the state. So, what we're running is a separate event. We want to bring as much educational visibility to this event. Let's talk politics for a moment. They're having this on October the 9th in Wise, Virginia, which, as some of your listeners may or may not know, is in that southwest corner of the beautiful Commonwealth. And they're doing it on Columbus Day. Our sense is to drive down coverage of what we think is a very important event and gives voters the tools that they need to make an educated decision come Election Day.
Well, and certainly, so this isn't held by like the League of Women Voters. This is actually the state gubernatorial commission said, let's do Columbus Day as a gubernatorial debate. That's
Well, both of these parties have to come together. As you know, you've got a Republican running and a Democrat running. So just like at the national level, you have negotiations about when these things are going to happen, if they're going to happen at all. So we've been watching this closely from our end in an effort to try to bring some visibility to it. You know, the notion, and at the national level, I don't know if you remember when they were determining the debate schedule for the presidential candidates. Hillary was always very reluctant to debate Bernie as the front runner. Usually, when you're the front runner, you play the tactic, well, I don't need to debate. The underdog always wants to debate to get a little bit publicity and some eyes on his cause or her cause. You know, the joke in our office was that Hillary always wanted to debate on holidays. We'll do it on Christmas Eve. We'll do
Sunday
it on
night,
Easter Sunday.
Sunday night during a football game. I think was one of President Trump's concerns. Was so both the Republicans and the Democrats, RPV, agreed to this debate, but at this point, it seemed like they were probably just happy through the tactics of, as you said, the Democrats saying, "We don't want to debate at all."
I think the Republican in this case is happy to get what he can get the Democrat to agree to.
Yeah.
What the Democrat side will try to do is lower coverage, lower visibility.
Sure.
They don't want to have to answer to any challenges or be pushed on any of their policy decisions. Our idea of going down there and hosting ACUF's policy forum was to make sure that people are focused on the important issues in this election. The idea of creating an economy that works, not just for Northern Virginia, but for the entire state.
Well, and then, you know, given coal country in that area of Virginia, this is certainly, though a very remote part of the state for most media coverage, from your standpoint, Ian, it's got to be great because this is one of those places where the downturn in our economy since 2006 really has been most profound, whether it's Danville on south from there.
That's right. Gay Lax, those southwestern parts. The media aspect of this is fascinating. In Wise, it actually falls into the media market that covers eastern Tennessee. So if the cameras come, they're good. If the local media shows up to this event, you'll be reporting on the Virginia governor's race to non-voters in eastern Tennessee, which is why we thought it was important to do what we could on our end to increase the eyeballs on this thing. We, the ACU, not the foundation side, endorsed Ed for governor in the primary race. But the more important thing for us to recognize is that people make an educated decision instead of getting wrapped up into sort of the partisan jabs of the day-to-day. There are really important things, that policy maneuvering that can affect people's lives in a profound way. So we want to keep voters' eye on the ball for these initiatives that can actually help them out and not just sort of stick it to the other guy. We really are in the business of trying to improve people's lives making them aware of what their rights are as American citizens, and to make sure that they exercise those rights to the best of their ability.
Ian Walters of the American Conservative Union Foundation, acufoundation.conservative.org is where you find them. I want to get into specifics of what you guys have going on. I want to, though, ask, because I had a couple of conversations with very liberal people over a research project that came out from the federal government regarding taxes. And I know the president has talked about massive tax cuts, corporate tax cuts, middle-class tax cuts. The average American citizen pays $10,500 per year in combined taxes, state, local, and federal, while they only spend $9,000 a year on food and clothing combined. That's a stunning number. And I mentioned that to a couple of my liberal friends who said, that's insane. And I remember why the original Tea Party in 2009, when we understood that T stood for taxed enough already, was such a winning argument across all these political party lines. I had Democrats and Libertarians and Republicans, and everyone was grasping this idea that government had grown so bloated and had so much money it was asking for more. Is this one of those positions that I think Ed can really win on, or maybe you don't want to get into specific candidates, but do you think this is one of those issues that Virginians are particularly keyed into? The polls I've read seem to say so.
Mitt Romney, when he ran, used this interesting metaphor where he said Republicans generally are selling vegetables at the dinner table, whereas Democrats are selling dessert. The philosophical distinction here, running with this metaphor, if you will, is that everybody politically, human beings, will respond positively to a politician who thinks that they can make magic happen, and who thinks that government is going to fix the problems that we all experience in our lives. Nobody has a perfect life. Everybody has things that they wish were better in their lives. And what Democrats are selling, the dessert, is that if you give us more of your tax money, if you let us take more of that, we can improve your lives. Now, what conservatives say is that that's absurd. As you just mentioned, we think that the government is way too bloated, that it's excessively bureaucratic, that they're wildly inefficient with the money that they take, and that the best way to improve people's lives is to allow people to do it themselves. And that means keeping the money that they earn. I think the folks over, there are lots of tax organizations up here in D.C., but I'm thinking of Grover Norquist, American for Tax Reform, who've somehow calculated that if a year is 12 months, you're working 4.5 months out of the year just to cover your tax bill. What Democrats won't tell you is that what they like higher taxes because that's how they fund their pet projects. Liberal projects are government projects. It's how they can appease union constituencies. If you think about the Democratic coalition, what their challenge always is trying to tie together union members with environmentalists who generally are not two groups that want to get along with each other. So how can they get them to go around? Well, with subsidies, whether that's subsidizing electric automobiles outside of a free market competitive zone. Everybody wants to say that Republicans, well, they're in the pocket of deep oil, of big oil and anti-environmentalists. No, I think we like markets. We'd be happy to buy electric cars if they worked and they were affordable. It's just like that with coal, electricity, solar power. We think that the market ought to determine what consumers spend their money on, and ought not to be dictated by government. It's the same thing with Obamacare. That's why people revolted against Obamacare, because it was a government mandate. It took all of the choice out of the individual's hands.
So what sort of things will we be seeing on the 9th in Wise County with the American Conservative Union Foundation and this event you guys are putting on? It sounds like those are a couple of big thumbnail sketches of some of the events that will be going on with you guys to draw attention.
We're going to talk about economy, of course. That's going to affect people's lives. There'll be some tax cut talk and what we can do at the local level. We're probably going to scrutinize both candidates' rhetoric on the energy debate and see where they are on a host of other issues, cultural issues. Is there a military? There are a lot of military funding issues down there on the coast in Norfolk and Newport News on the other side of the state. So we want to make sure that the voters have a full picture of where each candidate stands. So what we're doing here in the office until that event on October the 9th in Wise is watching this race just as closely as we can to see where the candidates are.
Well, it's very important because to this point, since the presidential election, I believe the liberal ideology and what remains of the Democratic Party now with this post-Bernie half-life they have and post-Debbie Wasserman Schultz emails half-life, they're 0 for 5 as last time I checked, Ian. And so they're really going to double down on Ralph Northam. He's gotten a ton of money from Planned Parenthood and other organizations. He was deciding votes on some of the most earth-changing Senate bills that have come out, including sanctuary cities. So there are things where Ralph tries to play Mr. Middle of the Road as a Democrat when his votes don't match it up. And we see this time and time again from members of the Democratic Party. Oh, I'm a centrist. I'm a Virginia Democrat. I'm a centrist. And then when the votes are counted, you say, oh, that doesn't look very centrist at all.
Yeah, our guess as we watch this, as hopefully savvy political prognosticators and observers, is that like that John Ossoff race in Georgia, like some of these other special elections that you mentioned, is that this is going to turn into a national race. What Democrats would like to do is make this a referendum on the president. I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing, Hollywood celebrity types, the Alyssa Milanos of the world, drop into Virginia to make an appearance at campaign rallies and try to rally as much of their base as they can, which, of course, Virginia over the past 10, 15 years has what was usually a reliable red state for most of our lives has turned into a purple state because some of the differing factors that are happening, especially in the Washington, D.C. suburbs that are sort of evolving with an influx of technology jobs and service industry and retail jobs. That lower part of the state, of course, is still the Virginia that I grew up with and that you grew up with. It's still very red with a lot of church-going folks who have those sort of traditional values that you would call conservative, big Second Amendment supporters and lower government type of conservatives. So we're trying to figure out what the dynamics of the state are. Now, the interesting thing is you've got this governor who we all know was very close with a certain family who used to occupy the White House and sought to occupy the White House but didn't get it. And the word on the street is that he'd like to make a run at that top job. So, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that he was pulling what strings he could, one, to make himself look good, and two, to make it look like that he can tip the scales in a way that has a positive impact for his career path, but a negative career impact for the citizens of the Commonwealth.
Ian, I have to ask you this. Here in Charlottesville, obviously, we had a little hootenanny on August 11th and 12th here where two groups that I'm referring to as the Marx Brothers. You had National Socialists and Global Socialists duking it out on our streets, most of them not from Charlottesville, and even the ones who were probably didn't count as much as 1% of our population. But that being said, since then, there have been explosions in our city council meeting, which is all liberal all the time. There is not a conservative in the bunch. And it's interesting to listen to the poor black community go after liberal Democrats for failing them. Is there an opportunity for conservatism? And I try to play this up all the time. Charlottesville voted in favor of Virginia's property rights constitutional amendment 60-40. So there are people who grasp core conservative principles like you should be sovereign on your property and nobody should just be able to come and take it away because they say so, and you should be fairly compensated. So those core conservative principles are something that the majority of Charlottesville residents, as a very liberal city, college town, as an example, maybe a canary in the coal mine. Is this something statewide that Ed can at least make the case of and pry away some of the conservative, or at least middle of the road Democrats away from Ralph Northam as he had to kind of swing to the left to face Tom Perriello?
I think there is a real prospect of that. The left is always so good, and it's backfiring them to a certain extent, Joe, about playing identity politics, about finding groups of people and tailoring their rhetoric to appeal to certain core constituencies. Republicans, on the other hand, usually don't do that type of thing and try to recognize policy initiatives that just help people. Mm-hmm. They're not interested in rewarding just union members or just rewarding African Americans. And I think especially in the African American community, you're beginning to see pockets pop up where folks are getting tired of being taken for granted by the left and being forced to sort of march in lockstep orthodoxy. Republicans and conservatives would say that what we're about is uplifting people, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of urban or rural, but enacting pro-growth economy of opportunity policies that allow people to work hard, keep their own money, buy a home, make sure that their kids aren't living in their basement. These are things that Americans share. These are American values.
Absolutely.
And it's not unique to one party or another. What are the Democrats going to do, as you sort of alluded to? They'll probably label folks as enemies of the state or traitors or racists or genderphobes or whatever the term du jour is. Today we're all cruel because the president has rescinded former President Obama's DACA order. So you can go with substance, you can go with policies that help people, or you can buy into the hot talk and the hot rhetoric that we saw in Charlottesville that really just leads to a more divisive America. It's sort of a regressive thing where we're moving back to the 1960s. This right to, and it's affecting people's social lives, where it's tearing families apart and relationships apart, and saying, well, I just can't talk to that person anymore because they have a view that I disagree with or find distasteful. This whole right to not be offended with the safe space culture, I think, is backfiring on a lot of people. And look, voters generally, they are not lining up with either of these groups that you saw in Charlottesville.
No, absolutely not.
We believe in that the American people, en masse, Republican and Democrats alike, are for the most part good, decent, God-fearing people who all want the same things. Yeah. And
even in DACA,
the candidate who's able to tap into that is going to be the guy who wins, probably.
And if you actually listen to what the president said, not this silly dog whistle rhetoric that the media now can just invent whatever they want the president to say by saying, well, that was a dog whistle for this, and then go off on a tangent. What the president said about the dreamers, about these kids, he actually was perhaps more compassionate than Barack Obama was about them. He says, I love these people. I want them to have a home. I want Congress to fix this. So I'm tearing this up.
The hypocrisy on this DACA thing is mind-numbing, Joe. First of all, it was Barack Obama who signed the executive order, I think, in 2014, 2015, before he signed the extension. He went around the legislative process, went around Congress. And at that time, liberals in Congress were cheering Obama, saying, thank you for taking away our constitutional obligation to create law, Mr. President.
Thank you for
and if it were such a priority, they would have made it permanent in the first place. It was President Obama who signed this by the power of the pen and making some phone calls from the Oval Office, who put this deadline on it to eventually expire. And that's what we're up against.
Ian, again, remind folks now, where can we gather with you in Wise on Columbus Day on October 9th? Is there a locus? Is there going to be a hall? Is there going to be
We're going to be very close to the debate site. I think we're still settling on a venue, but the idea is that we will be on campus there in Wise, Virginia. So we ought to be able to walk from our event directly over to the debate. And we hope that your listeners will consider joining us. You can check us out at conservative.org and ACU Foundation. .org.
And one last one. Do we have a date set for CPAC 2018?
You bet. We live the CPAC 365 lifestyle here, Joe, and we look forward to seeing you next year at the Gaylord, February 21st through the 24th.
All right.
Just a short drive for your listeners. Come be a part of all the action. We'll make some history together.
We'll be the loud ones in the corner, just like always on Radio
That's right.
Row. Ian, thank you so very much. You have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us. And, yeah, we're going to get the word out about this October 9th event in Wise and get as many people down there as we can. But until then, have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us.
We appreciate all the hard work you do, Joe. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you, sir. And again, it's conservative.org where you can find out more about them. Thank you for listening this week. It's been a great conversation. Again, thanks to Hans Bader as well for his visit with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, a presentation of the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas from Charlottesville, the second greatest city in the history of mankind, despite what everyone's done to my town. So long, and thanks for all the fish.